My family tree runs from the birth of Henry Arblaster in 1580 down 20 generations to Grayson and Claire Arblaster, my son Peter and daughter-in-law Erin's children, 5 years and 3 years old, respectively. What follows are a number of slides documenting the more recent background in this history and more particularly my life. This is a fragment of a certificate given to my then 13-year-old grandfather, Samuel Arblaster, apparently given to him by the Department of Science. So as to why they'd be handing out freehand drawing certificates is a puzzle to me, but there it is. This is a certificate evidencing that my grandfather, Samuel Arblaster, was appointed the Justice of the Peace for the County of Stafford. It notes that he was the chairman of the Brown Hills Urban District Council. That sounds like fun. And I expect he became Justice of the Peace ex officio that office. Basically, the previous JP had died or otherwise been incapacitated, and he was filling in a hole until a permanent appointment could be made. This is a microfilm copy of a passenger list for the Port of Halifax. If you could see the original, you'd see that my grandfather, Samuel Arblaster, was listed, and also, as we'll see, the rest of his family at that time. They sailed on the SS Mongolian from Liverpool to Halifax, and as you'll see, they eventually made their way to Quebec City. This is the SS Mongolian. It was a single-engine ship, but it also had two masts that were rigged for sails if the wind was blowing in the right direction. It was sunk by a German submarine in the summer of 1918 off the coast of England. This is an excerpt of a 57-year list of passengers who arrived at the port of Quebec City. I assume that it was the SS Mongolian that brought my grandfather's family there, but I'm only guessing. You'll see his name listed, my grandmother's name, Louise, her maiden name was Jones, as I recall, and their 6 children. You won't see my father's name on that list, Robert, because he was not to be born for another decade. This is the cover page of a compilation of the roles of officers and men of the number 3 Siege Battery of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The date of this was December 18, 1915, and it indicates they're embarking from St. John's, New Brunswick. I assume that's to go to Europe. Amongst the members of the number 3 Siege Battery was my Uncle Victor. You'll see his name second from the bottom. His rank was gunner. And you'll see his next of kin was my grandfather Samuel, who lived in Montreal. The date he signed up was October 12, 1915. This is a photograph of my uncle Ted Rockcliffe and my Aunt Ivy. Her maiden name was Arblaster. It indicates on the back of the photo that it was taken at home, somebody's home, or it looks like Hogwood, Stafford, England. He was, when he retired in the late 50s, early 60s, he was a senior manager at Bell Canada in Montreal. My aunt was a housewife, as far as I know, all her life. They were great golfing fanatics, and they could actually walk to a golf course from where they lived on St. Mary's Drive. This is a notice that was published in an official Quebec publication that serves as the vehicle to bring to the attention of the public in an official way certain facts. In this case, the incorporation of Arblaster Bakeries, Limited. You'll see the incorporators are a lawyer and a couple of secretaries. That was the way corporations were set up back in the day, and in many cases today. It's an in-office incorporation, but the control ownership of the business passes on to the client. In this case, Samuel Arblaster. So this was a corporation to take over his bakery business. To explain, when he came over to Canada in 1910, before then he was a baker in his neck of the woods in Staffordshire, and he carried on that trade when he arrived here in Canada. My Aunt Ivy told me that his business ran into trouble as a result of the Depression because his clients included large operations, restaurants, private clubs, this sort of thing, and people, unsurprisingly, weren't paying the bills. And I don't know if this incorporation was to protect him or what, but for some reason he decided to incorporate, which would shield him from creditors. Today, the maximum capitalization of a company can be anything you want to make it, but I think back in this day, the capitalization generally tried to track the value of the company, exclusive of or inclusive of debt, as the case may be, and in this case, it was $20,000. If you adjust for inflation and bring it to 2020 value, it's going to be a lot more than that, obviously. This is my great-grandfather, John F. Donald, and his wife, Jane. Her maiden name is Chalmers, and we'll hear more about that later. It appears to be that they're sitting on the front porch of their house. The back of the photo indicates it's about 1898. If so, this would be in the county of Lambton in Plympton Township. The two toddlers in this photograph, not the one sitting on the hood of the car, which is, by the way, a McLaughlin Buick, but the two sitting in the laps of the two ladies, I think one of those may be my mother, and the man in the seat behind them is, I think, my grandfather, Stuart. Back in the days before the internet and television and even radio, the only way to get out messages to a wide group of people is through print. And entrepreneurial publishers would send research crews out to regional areas to gather up background and produce for that area for the county of Lambton in specific. It's a biographical record, and it'd be sold. Certainly everybody who's listed in it is going to buy a copy. One of the biographies in this compilation is that of my great-grandfather, John F. Donald. You'll see him listed in the bottom left-hand corner on this index page. He obviously purchased a copy because it was passed down eventually to me. Now, John F. Donald's entry, and by the way, he would have been my great-grandfather, indicates that he was the skein of John Donald, who had come over from Scotland in the early 1800s, settled in Lanark County, and eventually he came to own 300 acres of agricultural land, plus he'd been a teacher for 20 years and retired on a pension. One of his sons, who would have been my great-great-grandfather, was John Donald. He was born in 1826 in Lanark County, and as an adult he moved on to Plympton Township, where he came to own over time 154 acres of agricultural land, which were taken over by my great-grandfather, John F. Donald, the self-same person who's in this uh, biography or biograph. He was born in 1860. My great grandfather, John F. Donald, when he owned the 150 acres, they discovered oil on it, and eventually there were, according to this summary, a number of oil wells on the property eventually. So this discusses in more detail the John F. Donald and the discovery of the oil wells. Tells us he was a liberal. It seems to be pretty common. He was married to Jane Chalmers, daughter of Alexander Chalmers, and we'll hear more about the Chalmers as we go through this record. Unfortunately, she died in 1902, leaving her husband, John F. Donald, and 3 children, William, John, Frank, and Stuart. Stuart was my grandfather. It indicates that in 1904, Mr. Donald remarried, and on it went. He was a member of the Beaver Lodge. The fragment of the paragraph at the bottom of the page is the subject of more detail in the next slide, but it makes reference to Alexander Chalmers, who is in my direct line going north on my maternal side. It contains some detail about his father, who obviously came over to Ontario, Canada, very early in the 1800s, and it's kind of intriguing. He was a supporter of the government during the Mackenzie Rebellion of 1837. Alexander, his son, was living in a lonely log cabin in Plympton Township. The detail on Alexander Chalmers' background is quite remarkable. I guess it was his grandfather, Robert Chalmers, came over from Scotland in 1821 and settled in Lanark County. It sounds like the story of the Donald line as well. He had a son, James, born in Lanark County, who, as he moved on in life, moved to Plympton Township outside of Sarnia. That would be the county of Lambton. And the description of what they went through to settle was pretty remarkable. This describes frequent visitors were wolves, bears, and other wild creatures of the forest. And on it went. Boy, life was tough back in those days. Alexander Chalmers lived with his father in Plympton Township until he was 20 years old. In 1858, he went out on his own, and with some money he'd made through his own efforts, purchased a tract of 100 acres of land. It included some mortgage financing, but he went on to work that land. He cut timber, and cleared a full 100 acres, which apparently was not an easy idea. Part of his farm is the present site of the village of Wyoming in Plympton Township, through which the Grand Trunk Railway passes. In any event, he married Janet Park in 1861, and together they had a family of 7 children, one of whom married John F. Donald, and they had 3 children, including my grandfather, Stuart. I'm intrigued that the first full paragraph on this slide talks about Alexander Chalmers having skills in manufacturing furniture. And it says some of the articles of furniture which decorate his home and are still fulfilling the purposes for which they were intended were the product of his own skill and ingenuity. I think one of those pieces of furniture is in my son's Peter's basement at the moment. On the Parks side of the family tree, I can recall in the 1960s, my family would go down to Sarnia to meet up with my mother's sister and their family, the Higgins. And we met an aunt of my mother's. I can't recall her first name, but her last name was Park. And her son was a trumpet player in big bands. As a sideline, he was also an insurance salesman. She was a very fine painter. So my grandfather's brother, William J. Donald, um, was at one point in time a professor. I'm not sure what he was a professor in, but presumably agricultural pursuits. He was an advisor to the United States White House on agricultural matters, and as you can see from this letter, his residence was at an apartment building off Washington Square in New York City. Here he discusses some background regarding the Donald family. I'll leave it to you to pursue it in detail. Apparently, William J. Donald and my mother were kind of trading information on family history. William J. Donald here writes about having met the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada in Ottawa, and he also met Fred McGregor, who'd been Prime Minister Mackenzie King's secretary for a number of years. So it sounds like he was pretty clued in. Also, it indicates that he met with one of his college students. So I guess he was a professor, and it indicates 1913. Here, John F. Donald is referenced as having married Jenny Chalmers. I understood her name was Jane. This listing, also in my mother's handwriting, has a peculiar list I don't understand on the far right side. There's a heading 1917, and below that, a bunch of numbers, and I can't quite connect those to any other information. This, my mother records that Alexander Chalmers was born August 19th, 1838, and his wife Jeanette, aka Jane Chalmers, was born August 14th, 1842, both in the township of Plympton. It's interesting at the bottom, it indicates John F. Donald and his wife Jane E. Donald had 4 sons. One of them, born 1888, just described as infant son. So I suppose he died in childbirth. This note from William J. Donald to my mother records that his daughter has graduated from college, and she's off to the teaching world.